No Alpha King in 1,000 years of recorded history had ever knelt, until the moment his fingers brushed the veil of a servant Omega and the bond shattered him. He collapsed before his entire court, brought to his knees by a single glimpse of the face she had hidden her entire life. Her name was Ilara, a servant in his own castle who had worn her veil since childhood, the only defense against a world where an Omega's face triggers an unbreakable claim on sight. For King Thuron, lifting it was a bored whim, a display of power over the most invisible person in his court. He never expected the bond to be mutual, and he certainly never expected that in seeing her, he would be the one stripped of all power, forever changed. In the kingdom of Lysandra, biology was law. For an Omega, the first direct gaze from an Alpha could trigger the mate bond, an irreversible soul-deep tether. It was a system designed for control, where an Omega's fate was decided in a single, unguarded moment. To be seen was to be claimed, which is why, from her earliest memory, Ilara's face was hidden behind a veil of dark, sheer silk. She was not born a servant. Her parents were minor nobles, loyal to the crown, until they were accused of treason when Ilara was just 7 years old. Their estate was seized, their name erased. They died in the dungeons beneath the very palace she now cleaned. Ilara was spared execution only because of her youth and her secondary gender. She was shipped off to a remote cloister for orphaned Omegas, a place of silent labor and absolute isolation. It was there an agging nun, Sister Marguerite, took pity on her. She saw the rare, luminous quality of the child, a beauty that even grime and grief couldn't fully dim, and she understood the danger. "The world will see you as a prize, not a person," she whispered, stitching the first veil. "This is your armor, never let it fall, your freedom depends on it." The veil was a promise and a prison. For 15 years, Ilara lived within its confines. When the cloister was dissolved by royal decree to staff the palace, her veil came with her. In the glittering, ruthless court of King Thuron, she was functionally invisible. A silent figure polishing silver, mending tapestries, always shrouded. The other Omegas in service, who wore simple headscarves but showed their faces, pitied her. The Alphas in the guard dismissed her as defective or perhaps disfigured. It was the perfect camouflage. King Thuron, meanwhile, was the embodiment of the system that had destroyed her family. Crowned at 22 after his father's sudden death, he had ruled for a decade with a focus on expansion and cold efficiency. He was a warrior king, his silver-white hair trademark of the pure Lysandran bloodline, his authority unquestioned. The mate bond, to him, was a political tool. He was expected to claim a highborn Omega from a rival kingdom to secure an alliance. The idea of being struck by some uncontrollable, fated passion was a weakness he openly scorned. The royal gathering was to be the stage for this political transaction. Diplomats and noble Alphas from across the realms filled the great hall, a sea of finery and calculation. The air was thick with the scent of ambition and expensive perfume. Ilara moved through the crowds like a ghost, refilling wine goblets, her veil a dark smudge against the vibrant colors. From his throne, King Thuron surveyed his domain, a man utterly bored. The negotiations were tedious. The posturing was transparent. His gaze, sharp and restless, skimmed over the crowd and snagged on an anomaly, a servant, an Omega, wearing a full veil in his court as if in perpetual mourning. It was an oddity, a silent piece of defiance he hadn't authorized. "You," his voice cut through the murmur, pointing directly at her. The crowd stilled, following his line of sight. "Why do you hide?" Ilara froze, a silver pitcher trembling in her hand. The entire weight of the court's attention pressed down on her. She bowed her head, her voice a thread. "By your leave, your majesty, it is my custom." "Custom?" Thuron echoed, a bored smirk playing on his lips. He stood, descending the dais steps with predatory grace. "This was a distraction, a toy to break the evening's monotony. There are no customs in my hall but mine. Let us see what merit your modesty has." This was the moment every lesson from Sister Marguerite screamed against. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She took a step back, but the crowd was a wall. Thuron closed the distance, his arrogance a palpable force. He reached out, his fingers, those of a swordsman, calloused and strong, closing not on her arm, but on the edge of the silk veil itself. The touch was a shock, not the bond, not yet, but the violation of it, the casual ownership in the gesture. He looked not at her eyes, but at his own hand as he began to lift the fabric. The silk whispered away from her skin. First it revealed her chin, then her lips, parted in a silent gasp, then the curve of her cheek, pale as moonlight, and finally her eyes, dark brown, wide with terror, and luminous with a depth that seemed to hold whole constellations. Theron's bored curiosity vanished, his breath hitched, his pupils dilated. The mate bond did not snap into place, it detonated. It was not a gentle pull, but a cosmic hammer blow to his very soul. A resonance so perfect, so absolute, it overwhelmed every sense. The scent of her, vanilla and night-blooming jasmine, and something uniquely, irrevocably hers asterisk, flooded him. The sight of her face was not just beauty, it was a homecoming to a place he never knew existed. The world, his kingdom, his throne, all of it shrunk to the singularity of her. The physics of his body betrayed him, his knees buckled. The impact of them hitting the marble floor sent a crack through the stunned silence of the hall. He knelt, not in ceremony, but in pure, unadulterated shock. His hand, which had lifted the veil, now reached for her, trembling violently. A collective, gasped inhale from 500 throats. Courtiers stared. Advisors gaped. The visiting dignitary he was meant to impress looked on in horror. No Alpha King had ever knelt. Elara stared down at the most powerful man in the realm, now at her feet, his expression one of shattered awe. The bond reverberated in her own chest, a warm, golden thread replacing a lifetime of cold isolation. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. It was everything Sister Marguerite had warned her against. And in that deafening silence, a new sound arose. A low, building growl not from the king, but from the ranks of his own royal guard. The captain, a fierce alpha loyal to the old ways, stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt. His eyes were not on his king, but on Elara, blazing with outrage and a vicious, possessive hunger. An unclaimed Omega, he snarled, his voice cutting through the shock. A veil breaker, by ancient law she is now a threat to the crown's stability. He took another step, his intent clear. The bond was fresh, not yet sealed. In the chaos, a stronger alpha could challenge for her, could try to steal the king's fated mate right from the floor of his own court. Theron's head snapped up. The ore in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a primal, molten gold rage. The cliffhanger was not the bond, but the war it was about to start. The king was on his knees, his mate exposed, and his own court was turning against them both. The growl from the royal guard captain wasn't just a challenge, it was a coup in a single syllable. In that split second, the bond was no longer just a shock. It was a weapon, and Elara was the prize. Captain Ryland's hand tightened on his sword. The bond is fresh, unsealed. By the law of the challenge, any alpha of standing may contend for a veilless, unclaimed Omega to preserve the strength of the bloodlines. He was quoting centuries-old doctrine, a brutal relic from more warlike times. His eyes, a hard flint gray, locked on Elara with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. He didn't see a person. He saw a key to unimaginable power, the key to controlling a king through his mate. King Theron moved. The man who had been on his knees a heartbeat before was a blur of armored fury. He surged to his feet, but not away from Elara. He placed himself squarely between her and Rylan, his back to her, a living shield. The submissive kneeling was over. This was the posture of a sovereign and a primal defender. "You will take your hand from your blade." Theron's voice was low, but it carried the weight of the mountains. It wasn't a command, it was a promise of violence. The gold in his eyes blazed, no longer just shock, but a firestorm of rage. "And you will look at her again only when she permits it." The hall was a tinderbox. Guards loyal to Ryland shifted. Nobles allied with the old families edged back, calculating. The visiting dignitaries watched, seeing not a romantic spectacle, but a fatal crack in Lysandran authority. Elara stood frozen behind Theron's broad back, the warmth of the bond a frantic pulse in her chest. She could feel his emotions through it, a torrent of protective fury, a dizzying possessiveness, and beneath it all, a terrifying vulnerability. His power, his very crown, was now inextricably tied to her safety. Sister Marguerite's warning echoed, "Your freedom depends on it." The veil was gone. Freedom was gone. What replaced it was a gilded cage at the center of a war. Ryland didn't back down. "Your Majesty, be rational. This creature is a servant, an orphan of traitors. The bond is a calamity, The Council will never accept it. The Northern Alliance will shatter. You must see reason. Let the challenge proceed. If the bond is true fate, you will win her fairly." His words were slick with poisoned logic, designed to appeal to the king's sense of duty and to the watching noble's prejudice. Theron laughed. The sound was dark, humorless, and final. "There is no fair in this. She is mine. The moment I saw her, the world realigned. Your laws are dust. Your challenge is a death warrant for you." He took one step forward, and the sheer force of his alpha aura, now fully unleashed and amplified by the raw, fresh bond, slammed into Rylan like a physical wave. The captain staggered, his face paling. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected a king embarrassed, confused, willing to be guided. He hadn't accounted for the transformative, all-consuming force of a true fated bond on an alpha of Theron's potency. But the political threat was real. An advisor, Lord Orin, scurried forward, wringing his hands. "Sire, please." The captain speaks crudely, but the concern is valid. "The betrothal to Princess Seraphina of the Northern Reach is all but signed. To repudiate it now for a veiled servant would be an act of war. Their army masses on our border as we speak." This was the true trap, not the sword but the state. Theron was caught between his soul and his kingdom. Ilara, listening, felt a cold dread seep through the bond's warmth. She was not just a woman, she was a casus belli. Theron didn't even look at the advisor. His gaze was still pinned on Rylan, but his words were for the entire court. "Let them come," he said, his voice ringing clear. "Let every army at our gates march. They will find a king who finally has something worth fighting for, not land, not gold, her." He finally turned his head just slightly, his profile stark. "Ilara." Hearing her name from his lips, in that tone, was a new kind of shock. It was recognition. It was a claiming that went deeper than any law. He then did something that silenced the hall more completely than any threat. He turned fully away from his challenger, presenting his back to a drawn sword, an ultimate act of disregard, and faced Ilara. His expression softened, the gold in his eyes melting into a warm, desperate amber. He reached for her hand, his fingers gentle where they had been forceful with the veil. "Come," he said only to her, "you are not safe here." He led her not toward the throne, but toward the grand doors at the rear of the hall. The crowd parted like a frightened sea. Rylan, suffocating under the king's dismissed aura, could only watch, seething, his challenge dying unfulfilled but far from forgotten. They did not go to the royal chambers. Theron took her to the king's watch, a secure tower room lined with maps and weapons, a strategic heart. The moment the oak door closed, shutting out the world, the tension in his shoulders did not ease. He paced like a caged wolf. "They will come for you," he said, almost to himself. Rylan was just the first. The council, the nobles, they will see the bond as a weakness to exploit, or a mistake to correct. Ilara stood in the center of the room, her servants dressed stark against the rich carpets. "You could let me go," she whispered, the words tearing at her. "Send me away. Save your kingdom." Theron stopped packing and was before her in an instant. "Look at me," she did. The connection sparked, a physical pull. "That is not a choice. Sending you away would be like cutting out my own heart and expecting to live. The bond, it's not a wish, Ilara, it's a fact. We are two halves of one whole. There is no kingdom for me without you in it." The truth of it hummed between them, but truth is a fragile thing in a palace. The first blow fell before dawn. It was not a sword, but a scroll. Delivered by a stone-faced counselor, it bore the seal of the High Council of Alphas. Theron read it, his face growing colder with each line. He finally looked up, his eyes finding Ilara where she sat by the window. "They have invoked the doctrine of stability," he said, his voice flat. "They claim a bond with an omega of unknown lineage, presented under chaotic circumstances, presents a clear and present danger to the realm. They are convening an emergency session to assess the bond's validity." Assess, Ilara felt a new fear, cold and bureaucratic. "They will try to break it," Theron clarified, the parchment crumbling in his fist. "There are rituals, potions. They will claim it's an aberration, a trick, or worse, that you bewitched me. If they declare it false, they can legally annul it, and you would be given to the highest bidder in a political match or executed as a sorceress." The walls of the gilded cage were closing in, built not of iron, but of law and tradition. Yet in the eye of this storm, fragments of a different truth began to surface. As Thuron's most loyal spymaster, a beater named Kael, dug into Ilara's past on the king's frantic orders, he didn't find the story of a traitor's daughter. He found a cover-up. "The evidence against your parents, my lady," Kael reported to them 2 days later, his face grim. "It was fabricated, planted by the former spymaster, who was deep in the pocket of the Northern Reach. Your father discovered a plot to assassinate the old king, Thuron's father. He was silenced. You weren't the orphan of traitors. You were the surviving witness to a conspiracy that murdered a king." The revelation was a seismic shift. Ilara wasn't a stain on the throne. She was its rightful vindication. Her veil hadn't just hidden her face, it had hidden this truth. Thuron saw it instantly. "This changes everything. Your lineage is not low, it is loyal, sacrificial. This is our weapon." But weapons are dangerous to wield. News of the spymaster's findings did not stay secret. In the shadowed corridors of power, those who had benefited from the old king's death and the false peace that followed began to stir. The conspiracy that had killed a king and orphaned a child was not extinct. It had simply gone to ground. And now, its last loose thread, the veiled Omega girl, had not only reappeared, but had become the single most important person in the kingdom. The bridge to the next crisis was built not of stone, but of silence. A silence from the Northern Reach, whose princess had been scorned. A silence from the High Council as they gathered their archaic tools of annulment. And a new, more dangerous silence from within the palace itself. The morning of the council's convocation, Ilara's handmaid, a woman assigned by the stewards, was found not in her quarters, but slumped in a pantry, a faint, unfamiliar herbal scent on her lips. She was alive, but in a deep, enchanted sleep. In her pocket was a single, dried petal of Moon's Bane, a flower known for one property. It could temporarily sever an alpha's sense of his Omega's bond. It was not an attack on the body, it was a test, a probe of their connection's strength, and a clear, horrifying message. They weren't just trying to annul the bond in court. Someone was already trying to chemically murder it in the dark. The war for the crown had just become a war against the bond itself, and the first shot had been fired in secret. Thuron held Ilara that night, his arms a vice, feeling across the bond for any hint of distortion, any weakening. The enemy was no longer at the gates. The enemy was in the walls, and their strategy was to make the king doubt the one truth he now held sacred. The attack with Moon's Bane was a declaration of war, but not the one Thuron expected. It revealed a terrifying truth. The conspiracy wasn't just political, it was alchemical, and they had a new, horrifying target. Thuron's reaction was not panic, but a cold, surgical fury. The sleeping handmaid was isolated in the dungeon infirmary, guarded by men whose loyalty was to the king alone. Kael, the spymaster, became a ghost in the palace, tracing the petal's origin. It led not to the Northern Reach, but to the palace's own botanical archives, a section restricted to the royal physicians and the High Alchemist, a member of the very council set to judge the bond. "The corruption is in the council itself," Kael reported, his voice hollow. "They aren't just judging you, they're trying to manufacture the evidence they need. A failed poisoning. Next, they'll claim they detected residual enchantment on the queen, proving the bond artificial." Ilara listened, the word queen still foreign and heavy. She was learning that in this game, truth was irrelevant. Perception was everything, and their enemies were masters of perception. The day of the council's convocation arrived. The Chamber of Ascension was a circular, austere room of grey stone meant to humble even kings. The 12 members of the High Council sat on a raised dais, old alphas and betas in somber robes. Captain Ryland stood prominently among the observers, a smug tilt to his mouth. The air smelled of old parchment and cold malice. Thuron entered with Ilara at his side, not behind him. He wore the crown, but his authority was now a brittle thing in this room. Ilara had forgone a royal gown. At her insistence, she wore a simple high-necked dress of dark blue. Her hair was covered by a light grey shawl, not the full veil, but a symbolic piece of armor. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fully exposed. The proceedings were fast dressed in ritual. The lead interrogator, an alpha with watery eyes and a vicious tongue, laid out the case. The bond, triggered publicly by the removal of a veil, a garment often used by enchantresses to focus spells. the Omega's traitorous lineage, now only partially rehabilitated by convenient new evidence, the instability it caused, citing Captain Ryland's lawful concern. They spoke of Elara as if she were a dangerous artifact, not a person. Then came the tests. They brought in a truth-seer, an ancient beater who could sense magical falsehoods. He walked around Elara, his milky eyes seeing nothing. "The bond is present," he wheezed. "I sense no external enchantment upon it." A murmur of disappointment from the council. Thuron allowed himself a sliver of hope. It was crushed immediately. The High Alchemist, a gaunt man with stained fingers, stepped forward. "The absence of spellwork does not prove a true fated bond. Only blood can do that, the old rites, the resonance of lineage." He produced a cruel silver needle and a shallow basin of clear liquid. "A drop of her blood and a drop of yours, your majesty, in the water of the first spring. If the bond is true and pure, the blood will merge and sing. If it is false or impure, it will repel and turn black." It was a trap within a trap. If they refused, it was an admission of guilt. If they complied, the alchemist could easily doctor the result. Thuron's jaw was granite. Elara, however, felt a strange calm. She looked at the basin, then at the alchemist's confident, greedy eyes. She remembered Sister Marguerite's stories, not just of warnings, but of old, almost forgotten lore. "We consent," Elara said, her voice clear in the silent chamber. Thuron's head whipped toward her, but she gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Trust me." The alchemist smiled. He approached Thuron first, pricking his finger. A single crimson drop fell into the water, blooming like a flower. Then he turned to Elara. As the needle neared her finger, she didn't flinch. The drop welled, dark and vital, and fell. The entire chamber leaned forward. For a breath, nothing happened. The two drops drifted separately in the basin. The alchemist's smile widened. Then a low, thrumming hum began to emanate from the water. The two drops of blood trembled, and then, against all natural law, they shot toward each other. They didn't just merge. They danced asterisks, spiraling around one another in the water, and as they did, the hum resolved into a faint, beautiful harmonic, like two perfectly tuned strings being plucked. The resonance of lineage. It was supposed to be a myth. The alchemist's face went slack with shock. He hadn't tampered with the water. He hadn't needed to. He'd been so sure the bond was false, he'd never considered it would pass the one test he couldn't fake. But the reaction in the room was not acceptance. It was deeper, more profound fear. An older counselor, Lord Valerius, stood, his hand trembling as he pointed at the still-singing basin. That harmonic, that is not just a true bond. That is the royal harmonic asterisk. It has not been heard since the bloodline of the first king, Arik the Unifier. A stunned silence, heavier than before. "What are you saying?" Thuron demanded, his eyes darting from the basin to Elara's pale face. Lord Valerius turned his awestruck, terrified gaze on Elara. "The resonance proves not just a true mate bond, your majesty, it proves a asterisk blood bond, a compatibility that only exists between lines of equal and ancient royal potency." He swallowed. "This woman is not the daughter of minor nobles wrongly accused. She carries the dormant, royal blood of the asterisk founder's line, the line we believed extinct centuries ago." The revelation detonated. Elara, the veiled servant, was a lost scion of the original royal dynasty. Her parents hadn't been killed for discovering an assassination. They'd been killed for who they were asterisk, for the latent power in their blood that threatened the current, younger royal house, Thuron's house. Ryland's smugness vanished, replaced by sheer terror. He hadn't just challenged the king's mate. He'd challenged a queen with a claim to the throne as old as the kingdom itself. The political calculus shattered and reformed in an instant. Many on the council now saw Elara not as a problem, but as a divine legitimization of the monarchy itself, a union of the two royal lines. But for the conspirators hiding within the council and the Northern Reach, this was an unmitigated disaster. Their pawn was now a queen in truth. Their secret was exposed, and a queen with a legitimate, rival bloodline was infinitely more dangerous than a servant. In the chaotic uproar that followed, the council session was adjourned. The bond was declared not just valid, but sacred. Thuron and Elara returned to the king's watch, reeling. "This changes everything," Thuron said, holding her face. "You are not just my queen, you are asterisk a asterisk queen, in your own right. Ilara felt dizzy, a lifetime of hiding, of being less than nothing, and now she was the bearer of a legacy that could eclipse the sun. It changes nothing for our enemies, she said quietly. It just means they have more reason to want me dead, and quickly. She was right. The conspiracy, now exposed and desperate, shifted from subtle poison to overt action. That very night, as Thuron planned how to publicly announce her lineage to solidify their position, the enemy struck not at the bond, but at its anchor. Assassins, clad in the colors of the Northern Reach, but moving with the precision of men who knew the palace's every secret passage, breached the king's watch. They weren't after Thuron. Their blades, coated with a silencing toxin, were aimed solely at Ilara. It was a kill squad, their mission clear: erase the living evidence of the Founder's bloodline before it could take root. The fight was short, brutal, and fought in the dark. Thuron and his personal guards cut down the attackers, but not before one blade grazed Ilara's arm. The cut was shallow, but the toxin worked fast. Not a deadly poison, but one that targeted the voice. As the last assassin fell, Ilara tried to cry out a warning and found she could only manage a raw, silent whisper. The toxin was a message, more grotesque than murder. They would strip her of everything. First her anonymity, then her voice, then her life. They would unmake her piece by piece. As the royal physician worked on an antidote, Thuron knelt by her bedside, her silent hand in his. The bond thrummed with his rage and fear, but also with a new, unwavering certainty. The time for defense was over. "They have shown us their hand," he murmured to her, his voice a vow. "They fear your blood, they fear our bond, they fear the truth, so we will give them nothing but truth from this moment on. We will take your name, your lineage, and our bond, and we will brandish them like a sword." He stood, the king reforged in the crucible of this attack. "Kale," he commanded the spymaster who stood in the shadows, "bring me the diplomatic draft for the Northern Reach, and prepare the Great Hall. At dawn, we stop playing their game of shadows." He looked down at Ilara, her eyes bright and fierce in her silent face. "We crown a queen in truth, and then we go to war." Dawn did not bring a coronation. It brought a declaration. With Ilara, silent but resplendent at his side, King Thuron faced his court not from the throne, but from the same spot on the marble where he had fallen. The great hall was packed, the air electric with dread and anticipation. This time, Thuron's personal guards lined the walls, their loyalty absolute. The traitors within the council were notably absent, already detained in the dungeons on evidence compiled by Kale. Captain Ryland stood under guard, his arrogance replaced by a cold sweat. Thuron did not shout. His voice was a weapon of precise, carrying calm. "Last night, assassins wearing the insignia of the Northern Reach entered these halls and attempted to murder your queen." A collective gasp. They failed, but they revealed a truth their princess's diplomats have long concealed. The Northern Reach was not seeking an alliance. They were finishing a war they started 20 years ago with the murder of my father and the framing of an innocent family to hide the last surviving heir of the Founder's line. He turned, extending a hand to Ilara. She stepped forward, her posture straight, her eyes speaking where her voice could not. The faint, healing cut on her arm was visible. "You see before you not a servant, but Queen Ilara of the blood of Arik, my fated mate, the living proof of a conspiracy that sought to keep our kingdom divided and weak by erasing its true history." He then delivered the blow. "Therefore, the betrothal treaty with the Northern Reach is void. Their actions constitute an act of war, not a war of my choosing, but one they began 2 decades past. We will finish it." The hall erupted. Some nobles cheered. Others, those with ties to the northern trade routes, looked ill, but the momentum was with the king. The story was too powerful, too clean. The lost queen returned, the old crime avenged, the king defending his fated mate and the kingdom's soul. In the following days, the machinery of war engaged with terrifying efficiency, but this was a war fought on 2 fronts. While generals planned campaigns, Thuron and Ilara fought the battle for the heart of the kingdom. Her coronation was not a separate event, but a strategic masterpiece. It was held not in the palace, but in the public square before thousands of commoners. Thuron, in a break with all tradition, did not place the crown on her head. The oldest living descendant of the Founder's line, a frail but revered historian from a distant monastery, did the honors. The crown itself was a new design, intertwining the silver hawk of Thuron's house with the obsidian wolf of Arrak's line. When the crown settled on Ilara's brow, a hush fell. Then a sound began, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very stones of the city. It was the same harmonic from the blood test, amplified 1,000-fold, echoing through the square. The people didn't just see a coronation, they felt it. They witnessed a myth made flesh. In that moment, Ilara ceased to be a scandal. She became a symbol. Her voice returned a week later as the antidote finally defeated the toxin. Her first words, hoarse but clear, were to Thuron in their chambers. "We need to talk about the succession." He smiled, a real, unburdened smile. "Already planning your reign, my queen?" "No," she said, her dark eyes serious. "Planning ours, the union of the bloodlines, it's more than political. That harmonic, Thuron, it's a power, I can feel it. It's not just us. It's the land itself recognizing the union. We need an heir, yes. But more than that, we need to understand what this bond means for Lysandra." This was the final, surprising pivot. The bond was not just personal or political, it was geomancy. Ancient texts, brought by the historian, suggested the founder's line had a mystical connection to the kingdom's stability. Years of drought, subtle magical decay, the weakening of borders, all had begun after the founder's line was believed extinguished. Their fated bond was healing a rift in the realm's very fabric. The war, when it came, was shockingly brief. The armies of the Northern Reach, expecting to fight a divided kingdom facing internal rebellion, instead met a unified Lysandra blazing with a fervor they couldn't comprehend. At the decisive battle of the Ash River, Thuron led the main force. Ilara, against all custom, did not stay behind. She rode to a high ridge overlooking the field, visible to both armies. She did not fight. She simply stood, crown on head, a banner of the united houses flying above her. For the Lysandran troops, she was a beacon. For the Northerners, she was a psychological weapon. The ghost of the bloodline they tried to erase returned. The Northern lines broke before the armies even fully clashed. Their princess, Seraphina, was captured trying to flee. In her possession were letters not just from the disgraced High Alchemist, but from Captain Rylan, plotting to open the city gates in exchange for a dukedom. The fallout was absolute. Princess Seraphina was ransomed back to the Northern Reach at a cost that bankrupted their war chest for a generation. The traitorous council members, including the alchemist, were publicly stripped of their ranks and exiled to a frozen border island. Captain Rylan faced the king's justice. Given the choice between a public execution and swearing a blood oath of perpetual service on the desolate northern frontier, he chose the oath. It was a living death for an alpha of his ambition, and a more potent warning to others than any blade. In the quiet that followed the victory, the real work began. Ilara, with her knack for detail and newfound authority, spearheaded reforms. She restructured the opaque council, inviting wisebeaters and even respected Omegas into advisory roles. She used the reparations from the north to fund schools and hospitals, not just more armor. Thuron, the warrior king, found his purpose shifting from conquest to stewardship. He governed with a confidence that no longer needed to prove itself, freed by the absolute certainty of his mate at his side. One evening, half a year after the veil fell, they stood again in the great hall. It was empty, cleansed of the memory of gasps and challenges. The moonlight streamed through the high windows. Ilara looked at the spot on the floor. It happened right there. Thuron followed her gaze. Without a word, he walked to the exact place and knelt, not a collapse of shock, but a slow, deliberate descent to one knee. He looked up at her, his amber eyes soft. "The most important moment of my life." She walked to him, placing her hand in his. "Mine too." She gently pulled him to his feet. "But you don't have to kneel anymore." "I know," he said, drawing her into his arms. "I want to, for you, I always will." The kingdom of Lysandra entered an era not just of peace, but of resonance. The strange harmonics in the land faded, replaced by bountiful harvests and a tangible sense of well-being. The story of the veiled servant queen and the king who knelt became legend, then myth, then foundational truth. And in a secluded royal garden, a single shoot of a tree long thought extinct, the moon's blessing counterpart to the poisonous bane, pushed through the earth. It was a final, quiet surprise, the land healing itself, offering a symbol of the new balance. Their reign, born from a single act of arrogant curiosity, had restored something ancient and essential, not just a throne, but a harmony. So what does the story of the Veiled Queen and the Kneeling King ultimately tell us? It's more than a fairy tale of fated love. It's a blueprint for a revolution that begins not with a sword, but with a single, vulnerable truth. Ilara's veil was her survival, but it was also the symbol of a system that demanded she make herself small, invisible for her own protection. Thuron's arrogance in lifting it was the catalyst, but his submission, his literal kneeling, was the key that unlocked everything. It was the moment absolute power recognized a greater force, the undeniable truth of a connection that rewrote laws, toppled conspiracies, and healed a kingdom. The story challenges the very architecture of power we see in so many tales. It asks, what happens when the strongest person in the room is also the most vulnerable? What happens when destiny isn't a gentle suggestion, but a seismic event that forces everyone to choose a side? Ilara and Thuron's bond was that event. It exposed corrupt foundations, revealed hidden lineages, and proved that true strength isn't about never kneeling. It's about knowing what, or who, is worth kneeling for. The lingering question isn't whether fated mates are real. It's what we do when we are faced with a truth so powerful it demands we dismantle our entire world to embrace it. Do we cling to the safe, known order, like Captain Rylan and the conspirators? Or do we have the courage to fall to our knees and rebuild from the ground up, like Thuron? Ilara's journey from a hidden servant to a crowned queen who heals the land is the ultimate power fantasy because it's rooted in a transformative vulnerability shared by both partners. They didn't just find each other, they forged each other into the leaders their world desperately needed. If you were captivated by this story of hidden identities, explosive revelations, and a love that literally changed the fabric of reality, then do us a huge favor. Tap that like button. It helps more viewers find stories like this. Share this with anyone who loves a tale where the underdog doesn't just win, but rewrites the rules of the game. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. We delve deep into the mechanics of legendary stories, uncovering the hidden patterns in the tales that capture our imaginations. Let us know in the comments what moment of unexpected vulnerability in a story has stayed with you the longest. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next narrative.